Alright, sorry about that. I got called away. So let's finish this lecture. We were talking about the women of Athens. Nearly all are female. Their duties were basically restricted to organizing the household, supervising slaves, domestic duties. Again, they did not have the right to vote. They were often lived separate from their men in separate quarters, and didn't even have the evening meals with their husbands. So this left their husbands kind of lonely. So often they would spend the evening with a hetera, which is a foreign woman, not an Athens-based woman, but a foreign woman employed as a courtesan, entertainer, or in reality, a prostitute. Alright, so the classical Greek art that's most famous, besides the vases, is the architecture. And we see that mostly in the Parthenon, the largest Greek building that really survived. And typically we see this architecture expressed in columns and lintels, the bars that go across the columns. The columns are the most famous, and the two most famous in the classical era are the Doric and the Ionic. The center art, Greece was kind of an artistic center. And then the Parthenon was a temple dedicated to Athena, and that was seen in the Acropolis. In its basic form, as I said, most temples were post and lintel, which meant they were columns with beams, lintels, laid across it. The walls and the roof were added to this kind of basic skeleton, but often they did not make it. Most of them were distinguished by their decorations on the vertical columns and the horizontal beams, and these decorations were called entablatures. The Parthenon was a great example of the Doric order. So that was the Doric columns were the ones used in the Parthenon. And oftentimes the lintels that were on top of it were mostly geometric shapes. Now, in the Parthenon, the columns surrounded an enclosed inner room or cella that held the huge cult statue of Athena Parthenis, or Athena the Virgin. Other buildings in the Acropolis included the massive gateway called the Propylaea. This led to ramps into temple-like buildings. The Propylaea was most noticed for its combination of Doric and Ionic order. Late in the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenians began the Erechtheum, which was an Ionic temple that encompassed several sacred sites. The Erechtheum was built on 2 levels with 2 porches. One in the Ionic style with continuous frieze columns, Ionic columns with continuous frieze, and the other with columns in the shape of maidens, called caryatides, which bear a heavy entablatures on baskets atop their head. Now, the friezes were those bars on top of the columns, and often these had sculptures in them. And there were 2 main types. The Doric order usually featured geometric panels called triglyphs, alternating with pictorial scenes called metropes. And these were usually done in high relief. Then you also had, in the Ionic, you had a kind of a continuous frieze that had a continuous sculptured scene, sometimes going completely around the sculpture. Other Parthenon sculptures include the 3 goddesses, which were the divine witnesses to Athena's birth. Her birth was very famous. Supposedly she sprouted from Zeus's side. At least that's one of her legends. And they're most famous for how much detail is given in their definition. Then we had some freestanding sculptures. The most famous was the Zeus sculpture, which was cast in exacting detail using a method that has been lost, a wax style method which has been lost. And you can really see the athleticism and the power of the god in this. And it's one of the few bronze statues that have lasted. And then we have another statue called the Aphrodites of Cnidos. And what's interesting there is one of the first time that women were sculptured nude. And you can really see great detail and the fluidity of her body. Then the other art form that the early Greeks were very famous for was theater. They also had some music, and we'll talk a little bit about their music, but their theater was especially important. And really the theater was a form of worship for the god Dionysus. And usually it was festivals, the theater plays were done on festivals that honored Dionysus, who was the god of wine, revelry, and of course intoxication. However, he also in his festivals usually ended with a very solemn performance of a severe Greek tragedy. The most famous of these Greek tragedies was Sophocles' Oedipus the King. You probably have heard of Oedipus theory, so you kind of have an idea of what's going on. But let me give you a breakdown of the story, and I'm asking you to read this play. So, that being said, if you have not read Oedipus and you don't want any spoilers, you may want to stop this video now and come back to it after you've read Oedipus. Now, the thing here is that most people know what happens in Oedipus. It's pretty famous. And to be honest with you, you can kind of see it coming. But I've not only have I put the play in for you to read, but I've turned around and I've put the play that's been performed. Both the full version of a good performance, and I also put in there a clip of a performance that would be in the Greek style. Greek tragedies were performed in a very formulaic manner. The Greeks would have these really heavy masks that they would wear that would help amplify their voice and express the emotions to the audience. They would have these big choruses in the back that would basically narrate the story. So Oedipus. Oedipus starts off with this young man coming into Thebes, which was under this terrible plague by this creature called the Sphinx. Yes, the Egyptian Sphinx. And the Sphinx would release the plague, would stop the plague, if someone could answer his riddle. Now, Oedipus had an interesting life. He knew something happened to him in his early childhood, and that caused him to have a limp. So when the Sphinx gave his famous riddle, what creature walks first on 4 legs, then 2 legs, then 3 legs? Oedipus, because of his limp, knew it was man. Man crawled on 4 legs, crawled on the ground, then walked on 2 legs, and then in his old age would use a cane, thus having 3 legs. So he solved the riddle. In return, Thebes, who had just recently lost their king, celebrated and gave Oedipus the kingship, which came with a queen. So he married this beautiful queen, and they had some children, and Thebes was in a wonderful position. Oedipus was a great king. Then, suddenly, everything goes bad. Thebes has another plague hit on it. The gods are punishing Thebes. So Oedipus calls for the seer Tiresias to come tell him why there's a plague on Thebes. And Tiresias comes and says, "Don't ask me this question." Oedipus forces him, finally he gives in and says it's because the previous king was killed, was murdered, and that murder went unavenged. So Oedipus declares he must find the killer. And Tiresias says, no, you don't want to go down this path, buddy. It's bad news. Well, it was bad news, because what we find out is that the king of Thebes and the queen were told by Tiresias many years ago that their newborn son would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. So they decided to avoid this predestined punishment of the gods, and they ordered one of the soldiers to take the baby out, cut its ankle, bind it, and leave it to die. Well, the soldier did that, but a shepherd came around and saw this infant and took pity on it. So he took the infant, brought it back and to his home, and what happened is, in his home, the king and queen had recently lost their baby due to infant mortality. And so he gave the baby to the king and queen, and they were thrilled. However, later when the child grew up, he went to the oracle at Delphi and was told that he would kill his father and marry his mother. And so in order to avoid that, he took off. He left. And when he left, he came across this crossroad, and in the crossroad was another king. They had a fight. He killed the king in his arrogance and continued on and landed in Thebes. What we find was that king that he killed at the crossroad was his father, and that his mother was the queen of Thebes, and they ended up giving birth to 3 children. Well, once all that came out, Jocasta, the wife, couldn't take it anymore, and she killed herself. But Oedipus felt that death would be too good for him. He needed to suffer. So what he did was stabbed out his eyes and then cast himself out of his city. So this was by many considered one of the greatest tragedies ever. In fact, the philosopher Aristotle said that Oedipus contained the essential elements of tragedy, which Aristotle analyzed in his book Poetics. He said, when tragedy's main character commits some error of judgment, he suffers a reversal of fortune and recognizes his folly. This spectacle achieves the tragic purpose, a cleansing, called a catharsis, of the audience's fear and pity. And Aristotle's analysis indicates Greek tragedy was a drama of primal suffering and fear, and few Greeks left the theater unaffected. One of the other famous Greek playwrights was Euripides. He wrote a famous play called Medea, which involved a lot of mystic sorcerers. It depicts a mystic sorcerer who murders her own sons in vengeance against a husband who abandoned her. But we also had some comedies here, and Greek comedies were usually very slapsticky. They involved a lot of physical humor. They involved a lot of body language, body insinuations, and they usually had a biting comment on current affairs. One of the greatest of the comedians was Aristophanes, and he wrote lots of satires. However, most of them did not survive. So we also had some Greek music, and the term music actually means of the muses, and the muses were the goddesses that inspired the arts, and music was especially important in poetry because most of the poetry was set to music. So instruments like the lyre, which later was associated with lyric poetry, becomes very important and famous. Alright, so that leads us to philosophy. Again, the Greek philosophy was very important in the classical period. This was set the stage for some of the greatest philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Socrates was most famous for his method of teaching, and he taught by questioning. He would constantly question his students, and this method was called the Sophists. And they were a little skeptical about some things and were constantly questioning. So Socrates really was the founder of this method, and he examined human affairs through questioning. However, Socrates did not actually write anything down. All of his material was philosophies was actually written down by his most famous student, Plato. So Plato wrote all of Socrates' major philosophical thoughts. He also wrote his own stuff, and some of his stuff had their own kind of philosophy. He's most famous for the Republic. And the allegory of the cave. The allegory describes ordinary citizens as prisoners chained in the cave who see shadows flicker across the wall and believe the images are real. Only a few brave and virtuous souls free themselves recognize the world of illusion in which they've been captive and clamber out of the cave into the light of truth. In the allegory, Plato was no doubt portraying Athens' imperfect and foolish citizens who had executed Socrates for trying to lead them out of the darkness of error. Plato's Republic describes the perfect gods. Describes the perfect polis, a utopia governed by enlightened authoritarian rather than Athena-style democracy. The Republic begins with a debate about the justice and ultimately connects the orderly society to a poor, properly ordered and virtuous soul. The human soul should govern itself by reason, using moral courage to rule out its appetites and attaining self-mastery and beautiful order by harmonizing its three parts. Likewise, there are three parts of an ideal society, according to Plato: the philosopher kings who rule wisely, the militant guardians who enforce their rule, and the ordinary citizens who perform all the physical labor. And our final philosopher is Aristotle. And Aristotle also was a part of Plato's world. He was the most renowned student of Plato, and he challenged Plato's teachings and became his own figure in philosophy. And his main belief was about metaphysics. So Aristotle's metaphysics began with the pronouncement that all humans by nature desire to know. Aristotle defined human happiness as an act of knowing. The eudaimonia, well-being, was something achieved in the exercise of humans' deepest nature, their intellectual capacity to know truth. In metaphysics, which is the study of ultimate being, Aristotle disputed Plato's claim that an object's form existed in a separate realm of the universal forms. The form of a manufactured object, such as a table, is immanent or contained in the object. The material stuff of the table is mixed with the form, the shape, and purpose given it by the carpenter. The objects of nature, such as a tree or apple, take shape given to them by the prime mover, which is the creator God, who is the world's first cause. Thus, every creature of nature is imprinted with a purpose or good that this prime maker, this creator, intended for it in creation. So Aristotle also wrote a piece called Politics, in which he opposed Plato's idea. For Aristotle, human was by nature a political animal, and the state a creation of nature. This meant that Greek political institutions like property, slavery, and subordination of women were natural too. So Aristotle wasn't exactly a good guy all the time. However, Aristotle concludes that a constitutional democracy best suits the Greeks, giving power equally to the virtuous and wealthy. Alright, and this led us to the Hellenistic age. This is the classical age of Greece ended with the general Philip of Macedon managing to subdue and unite the independent Greek states. Philip was succeeded by his 20-year-old son named Alexander and became Alexander the Great. Alexander was a pupil of Aristotle who became one of the world's greatest conquerors. Alexander was a great lover of classical civilization. And he tried to keep a lot of the classical Greek civilization, but at the same time added his own touches. So, the Hellenistic legacy. So, Hellenistic civilization was a composite of Greek and the Near Eastern elements that differed substantially from its classical predecessor. Politically, the Greek city-states lost their self-sufficiency and had encouraged the burst of classical creativity in Athens. Suddenly, the world became under a dictator. Alexander may have been a great conqueror, but he was also a dictator. However, he did try to keep a lot of the classical arts in his great library, the library at Alexandria. During the Hellenistic age, one of the philosophies that became popular was Stoicism. It was named for the Stoa, or porch in Athens, where its adherents gathered. Its father, Zeno, was a student of Platonic Academy and an admirer of Socrates' ethical teaching. In the Stoic view, the material world is composed of fiery divine substance called the Logos. Divine reason inhabits and rules the entire cosmos, and hence every event in the world process is a consequence of reason. The natural law of reason is necessary and inescapable cause of all events and all actions. So architecture in the Hellenistic series kind of preserved the Greek tradition, but it did employ more urban planning and kind of had a little more purpose to it. The Dying Gaul was part of the statue group that the Hellenistic ruler Alexander commissioned to honor his battlefield opponents. This is one of the great statues. The warrior had just committed suicide with his sword, and it had fallen out of his hands. Again, it's kind of very realistic looking, naturalistic. And that's really the last slide in my PowerPoint. So that sculpture, there's also one more sculpture of the Hellenistic period that's very famous, and that's a Laocoon and his two sons. And they're set upon by serpents. And the issue here is the treatment of Laocoon is more turbulent and impassioned than any other classical sculpture. The figures struggle, a violent struggle creates a sense of dramatic conflict and emotion. Thank you for putting up with my horrible voice. And I hope you enjoyed our look at classical Greece. We'll be looking next week at classical Rome. Enjoy Oedipus. It is a fun play. I also put a short version of Oedipus up, so you have at least an idea of what's going on in the play if you don't have time to read the whole thing. Good afternoon and enjoy your week.